Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Exercise is Bullshit. I'm so excited to be joined today by Dr. Sean Preuss. Sean is a EDD, which we can explain the difference between a PhD and an EDD if we need to. And he's a good friend of mine, a good friend of the program, a great exercise scientist in his own right. And I'm just so excited to have him on today to talk about a variety of different topics on the podcast, which, as we know, we try to use a different acronym every week. So this week, bullshit stands for because updated lifting literature surely has to inform training. So obviously we've got the guy who's the researcher. We wanted to talk to him about all things exercise science. Sean, say hello. It's good to have you.
Logan, it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, so I'd love for our listeners if you could just give us sort of a brief background, sort of who is Dr. Sean Preuss, how did you get into exercise, kind of your 30,000 foot cliff notes view of how you got where you are today and how you became Dr. Preuss as opposed to just good old Sean.
Sure thing. As a whole, my purpose, as I see it in life, is to get people to exercise and stick with exercise. Specifically strength training, because I feel strength training is so valuable. I don't need to tell you on that, Logan. You know very well about this. Specifically in my career, I have done a number of different things. I have been a professor since 2013. I've taught exercise science for a couple of different colleges and universities, including Bryan University, Grand Canyon University, Justice College, and the University of Phoenix. I was a personal trainer before that, where I instructed over 1,300 sessions, or 13,000 sessions, excuse me. I've written over 500 research-based articles. Writing's been a big focus of mine. And I was also previously the chief experience officer for the Perfect Workout, which is a personal training company located across the US.
Yeah, and I definitely want to talk a little bit more about the Perfect Workout for some of our listeners that aren't familiar with their modality and the type of training they offer and how they've sort of changed over the years. So we'll certainly touch on that. What are you doing at the moment? So you mentioned teaching in the past. You were former chief experience officer with Perfect Workout. What does Sean's days look like these days? What does your training look like these days as well? Maybe just give us an idea of what's going on in your life at the moment.
Sure, good questions. I'm currently a professor. I'm teaching at two different universities, teaching exercise science, and then using the other time, much like we are always doing, trying to gain more education and grow, attending Toastmasters meetings, working with mentors, reading research, writing, all those things that I think we both engage in. So yeah, at the moment, that's what I'm engaged in as far as training goes. I've been cycling through a number of different workouts over the past few months and then measuring my body composition twice a week to look at the trends and how my body responds to different programs.
What do you typically use for measuring body comp? Sorry to cut you off.
Mostly I've been using the Bellow and Fiddle, which are available on Amazon. They're combined, I believe, for $500. They can do as little as 4 different locations. At 5 different locations to estimate body fat and muscle composition, although you have the opportunity to measure more locations. The whole process with Bellow and Fido takes about 5 minutes to 7 minutes. I also use biological impedance. I use a scale standing on where it's sending that low level electrical current to my body. I don't really trust the accuracy of those numbers for body fat percentage. However, I do think it has value for identifying trends. If I'm gaining muscle, losing muscle, gaining fat, losing fat, I use a scale as well. And then I also take my waist and hip circumference measurements. In terms of what I'm doing training-wise, currently I'm doing full body and lower body 2 to 3 times a week on separate days, lower volume workouts. I was doing full body every day before that as a 2-month trial to see how that impact my body composition.
Like 7 days a week?
No. 5 to 6 days a week, which is still a lot for me.
Yeah,
low volume, full body workouts. Typically, I train 3 to 4 days a week doing either upper and lower body splits or full body workouts. So I'm constantly tweaking things and just looking at how my body responds. Of course, I always believe I'm going to stumble upon some perfect recipe, which doesn't exist. but it's fun to imagine that there is something out there that is maximally effective without being super time consuming.
Yeah, it's interesting that we all kind of chase that, that white rabbit too of
Yes.
maybe if I just tweak this or do that. Now, when you were doing 6 days a week, I'd be interested to hear as far as a full body program goes, was it super minimal volume? So you were sort of equating time over the course of the week, maybe doing 2 or 3 exercises, or was it 5 or 6? Like, what did that look like when you were experimenting with 5 or 6 days per week as far as a routine perspective?
When I trained full body every day, I at first kept the amount of volume consistent. So it wasn't different than what I was doing with my previous routine where I'm lifting 3 to 4 days a week. Then I didn't really see much change. So then I increased the volume to 2 sets per exercise, full body routine. I kept the amount of exercises less on the lower end, about 6 exercises per workout. I did actually see some muscle growth originally, but then that decreased. I went to 3 sets per exercise. I saw a small jump in muscle growth, and then that tapered off and actually lost a little bit after a few weeks. And that's when I dropped. I never thought I would continue doing full body routines, but I wanted to see what it was like. And it seemed like my body was able to tolerate the volume for a time. And then eventually at least me reading into it, needed more recovery time.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring that up too, because obviously, in the last month or so, there's been, and maybe by the time this comes out, it'll be 6 months ago, but that paper that recently circulated where they were doing, 52 sets of quad exercises per week, and to me, I don't take that personally. I think it's totally fine, and I think it's probably feasible that at least for a short period of time that could be beneficial. But it's interesting, depending on who you talk to, some people are like, oh, see, that means higher volume's great. That's what works. Other people are like, no, there's no way these sets were hard or anything like that. To me, it just shows, I want to see what would happen if they continued it out, right? And you kind of did an N of 1 experiment there, obviously not even nearly the amount of volume, but sure, 52 sets works for 4 weeks. Would it work for 8 weeks? Would it work for 12? Would it work for a year?
6 months,
Yeah, and the answer is probably not as effectively, if at all, over the long term. So interesting to do that N of 1 stuff. I mean, obviously it's anecdote, but I think that to me is a lot of times more powerful than just some random study we see on Instagram, because it's like, well, you actually did it. You were measuring. I know you're a scientist. Whether or not the standards you use would be, valid enough to publish a paper on, who knows, right? But it's interesting to people in the industry, especially people like myself, to say, oh, okay, well, that's kind of what we would expect, like a little bit of improvement, then you kind of compensated and you sort of teetered off a little. So super interesting. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your experience at Perfect Workout. It's a very large company. I'm not even sure how many locations they have now. I think it's over 60, maybe closing in on 70 locations.
Around 75, I believe. Close to 75.
So close to 75 all over the country. Maybe give us, I know you're not with them anymore, but I think you have a pretty good relationship with them still. What does that company look like for our listeners that are maybe not familiar? And then what did you exactly do for them? What was your role like with Perfect Workout?
Well, the Perfect Workout, they are, I would say, experts in brief, high intensity training sessions. So they're doing 20-minute workouts, and the sessions are literally 20 minutes. So it's not 30 minutes where you come in for a 20-minute workout and you have some conversation on the front end and the back end. The appointments are actually 20 minutes. People are completing about 6 to 8 exercises per workout. Those exercises are taking the failure, and they're using a super slow style tempo where it's roughly 10 seconds on the lifting phase or the concentric phase, and roughly 10 seconds on the lowering phase of the rep or the negative phase or the eccentric. And so they're doing that twice a week. Some people come in once a week. I think they have a handful of people come in 3 times a week. And now they're doing that. It's 70 something locations across the country, plus there's virtual training. My role with the company is what was to work on trainer education, as well as looking at aspects of how to improve both member experience and member education. So I was going around to different locations, observing the trainers, coaching them, and then providing workshops in person, as well as leading webinars, organizing webinars, writing content, and basically working as a whole to improve the training quality of the company.
That's great. Super interesting. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Perfect Workout, it is an awesome company. They've been doing a lot of good for just promoting high intensity training nationwide. And it seems like they're making a little bit of a shift now, which is cool. We talked about this a little bit off air, kind of going more the ARX isokinetic route, which I think will be interesting to see how they develop that. For our listeners who are familiar with ARX, it's isokinetic training, so it just matches your resistance wherever you are in the strength curve throughout each exercise. But really, really interesting equipment, expensive equipment, but can be super efficient and really cool from a tracking perspective. So I understand why they would be interested. Can you talk a little bit more about what that shift has looked like? I think maybe you were there partly during that shift over.
And now they use both types of equipment. So there's the Nautilus machines and dumbbells plus the ARX equipment. And if you're listening to this, you're not familiar with ARX equipment, it's a motorized resistance machine that you're fighting against, I guess you could say. You're providing resistance against, and it's measuring the amount of force that you are producing to ideally you're producing more force over time because you're getting stronger and your muscles are getting larger. And these machines are very versatile. So one of the machines can, I think, perform 7 different exercises. Another one's about 12 or 13 different exercises. So they are more expensive pieces of equipment, but they're versatile in that you could be doing 20 different exercises between 2 machines as opposed to needing to buy. In the case of a standard selectorized machine, you'd have to buy 20 different machines to do 20 different exercises. So you're getting more bang for your buck in terms of exercises. And the belief on this, and based on initial research, is that you can actually get more benefit from this adaptive resistance equipment because it is providing unlimited amount of resistance. So even though you're stronger on the eccentric phase, you're getting more resistance that will match that higher level of strength on the lowering phase. And then when you're weaker on the lifting phase, you're still getting a matched level of resistance, a lower resistance for that lifting phase. So essentially you're getting a more evenly matched level of resistance. And the belief is that will lead to a better workout and in less time.
Yeah, and there's super interesting machines, and I think Jim Keen, who's been with them for a long time, would probably tell you as well that it's really just limited by your imagination as far as what you can do on them, because certainly you can do a lot more than 12 exercises if you're so inclined, right? If you want to get creative with stuff. So they are pretty cool, especially the I think it's the Omni is the one that has the multiple different pulling angles.
Yes.
So super cool equipment. If you've never used it, it's certainly a game changer. The first time you do it, it'll wake you up. So let's talk.
It's not an easy workout for sure.
Yeah, definitely not.
You can choose to push yourself with 100% effort from the first rep, and if you do that, by the time you get to that 4th, 5th, 6th rep, I mean, if you're absolutely insane, you might program it to go 7 or 8 reps. By the time you get those last 2 reps, you don't have much left. And that lack of strength, that fatigue shows up on the monitor as it's telling you you're not nearly producing as much strength as you were in those first few reps.
Yeah, it's the great ego equalizer for sure. So let's just talk about, you mentioned the articles. You've written over 500 articles, over 13,000 personal training sessions. I'd love to hear just a little bit about your thesis, your doctoral degree, just like what was that about? How did that look for you? And when did you go through that whole process? And then we can kind of jump into some of these topics for today.
Sure. I have a doctorate in education, as you mentioned before, Logan. It's an EDD as opposed to a PhD, which is a doctorate of philosophy. The difference of mine is I learned more about, one, the science of teaching, and also how to create educational experiences. And it's also more, I would say, practical and field-based where there was an aspect of research as well. So I did conduct research, an in-person strength training study, which was published. I did observe and view other research, but it wasn't as research heavy as a PhD, where it's advancing knowledge, but it's not really working on how to apply these things in practical environments. So my dissertation, it was focused on taking people who don't regularly exercise and putting them in a strength training program, much like what is done at Discover Strength and other high intensity facilities, twice a week, full body workouts, one set to failure, but also attach some behavioral aspects to see if these people who are participating, who haven't stuck to a workout program, can we get them to stick with a workout program? And thankfully we had, I believe it was a 93% maintenance, where almost all the people in the study stuck with it. And then there was an 83% attendance for the workouts. So all the attendees were supposed to train twice a week, and they completed 83% of those. I could be slightly off, but it was in the low 80s. And so largely people completed their workouts. And if you look at the research on strength training benefits when it comes to gaining muscle mass, gaining strength, and changing body composition, the research shows a threshold of about 70-80%. If you would at least complete 70-80% of your workouts, you can obtain those benefits. When you fall below that amount, you're not successful. And we were able to get people to attend most of their workouts, and sure enough, they got stronger. They reduced their systolic blood pressure, they gained more confidence, and achieved a number of other benefits.
Yeah, and I think it's so practical because these were real people, correct? These weren't 18-year-old students, right? These were people in the real world.
Correct. This wasn't a study with 21 to 23-year-olds. No, these were people who were strength training at their workplace.
Yeah. Yeah, and to me, research like that is so meaningful because of, if we reference that 52 set study again, right? It's like, well, if you're a 19-year-old kinesiology student, obviously they're not going to threaten your grade for the research paper, but you're probably thinking about that in the back of your head, like, I wonder if I'm going to, make a good impression on my teacher if I don't show up for my workout classes, right? So maybe that's not the best way to show long-term retention. Whereas, just people in the Gen Pop that actually show up 80% of the time, that's pretty good retention rating, especially if they're not getting anything out of it besides, strength training and the benefits that come with that. Yeah, that's awesome. So I'd love to ask you just a question I've been asking all my guests so far, because I find it super interesting to have this scientific mindset and really just be open to changing with the new evidence that's coming in, right? We, as scientists, never want to be completely dogmatic on anything, because we'll always get burnt in the long term. So what is something you've really changed your mind on in the last, say, 1 to 5 years, taking a big 180 on when it comes to exercise science?
This is such a good question. And do you read from Adam Grant? I'm a big fan of the work of Adam Grant, who's, for anybody's listening, he's an organizational psychologist. He wrote a book called Think Again, which talks about how slow we are to change our minds on things. And I'm sure that anybody can think of an example where they're like, oh, I know this person who continues to have this belief in this area of life, and even though it's objectively wrong and all the evidence says it's not true, they still believe that. So to answer your question, one of the biggest things that I've changed my mind on is range of motion. And I'm pretty sure you know where I'm going to go with this. I am a big believer in range of motion, and it's probably the biggest critique I have of people who work out in public gyms is they largely do not lift the full range of motion. What the research has been showing in recent years is that full range of motion is important, but if you train with a partial range of motion and it's on the long muscle end of the rep, where you're the stretched end of the repetition, you can actually gain just as much strength and muscle mass. To make this a little bit more digestible, if you think of a bicep curl, we're talking about the lower third, right? When your elbows are straight, lifting about a third of the way up, half the way up. If you just did that lower half or third of the rep, if you were doing squats and you just did that lower third or lower half of the squat, you'd get as much strength and muscle as you would if you did the whole movement. So partial range of motion does work more than what I previously thought, as long as you're doing that part, that stretched end part of the range of motion.
Yeah, I think that's a great one, and something that we've been talking about ad nauseum. I feel like with every guest
Yes.
that comes up, and then also I actually just had a podcast that I did with Lawrence Neal for High Intensity Business, and this was something we spent some time on that I've been incorporating into my own training as well. And it'll be super interesting to see how the research, because there's still only like 5 studies on this, right? But it's very promising, and I think it's certainly something like you mentioned that we can put in our toolbox as far as hypertrophy and strength gains go. It looked like you were going to say something there. Go ahead.
No, and I by the way, I saw parts of the interview with Lawrence, which was great. And I loved several things that you talked about, including you talked about how high intensity training is the most practical, probably the best approach for about 95% of people, which I thought was really well said. Another thing I would say, to get away from it's the range of motion topic is the hot topic of the moment of the last few years. The choice of weights, and another thing that I'm big on is choosing heavy weights. And I still think that for certain goals, you should lift heavy. But if your goal is to gain muscle, something else we've seen in the last few years is that you can gain as much muscle size from lifting basically 30% 1-rep max and higher. So you could do half your heaviest weight that you can do 1 rep with, or 80% of your heaviest weight, and you'll get about the same muscle growth. Assuming that you're training with equal volumes. And so that's another thing that where before I used to just think that light to moderate weight training was a waste of time. And it was basically people avoiding discomfort. And now I realize, no, really, if you want to gain muscle, as well as there are some other benefits of lifting light to moderate weights, you can do that effectively with those kinds of weight loads.
Yeah, and actually that's a perfect segue, because that was technically my second topic that we were going to talk about. But since you already brought it up, we might as well dive into that. This idea of lifting heavy versus lifting light. And, there was this long time idea, and this was what I was taught in middle school, high school, early college in my exercise science classes, is the idea of the repetition continuum. So do you think that you could sort of paint a picture for us of what we used to think? And you teased it a little bit there, but what did we used to think the repetition continuum was, and how did it look when people were training?
So repetition continuum and how we would think of training in, putting it into neat boxes that would make things simpler, which is still, by the way, how it's taught with one of the major certifying agencies for personal trainers, is that when you choose your weights and perform different amounts of reps, it will lead to different outcomes. So if you chose very heavy weights that you were able to do for only 1 to 5 repetitions, somewhere in that range, that would be the best for gaining strength. If you went a little bit lighter and you chose weights that you could do for roughly 6 to 12 reps, that would be best for gaining muscle. And then if you chose weights that were on lighter than that, which were roughly 12 reps or more, so up to 20, 25, 30 reps, in that range, you'd build muscle endurance. So if you were an endurance athlete, someone who was like a long distance runner, or if you competed in some kind of muscle endurance competition, like you were trying to do the most push-ups versus somebody else, or you're preparing for police or military tests where they more so rely on those muscle endurance activities, you would just stay solely in that weight range where you could do 12 plus reps or more than 12 reps. And if you're gaining strength, you again would go to weights in that 6 to 12 range, etc. And research has slightly supported this, but mostly just proven that this is not necessarily the case. You can achieve multiple goals in multiple groups of different types of training. So you don't necessarily have to just stick to 1 to 5 rep loads if you're trying to gain strength, etc.
Yeah, I think that's a great explanation, and I think even to expand on that a little more, it's like so many things in the strength and conditioning space and just the exercise science space. It's just reinforced by people who are genetically predisposed to do those things. Meaning, the strength athletes are lifting with the heavier weights and less reps, right? And then the endurance athletes are sort of gravitating towards these higher rep ranges with the thinking that that's what they need to do for air quotes muscular endurance, and then just reinforcing these philosophies because people are seeing these high level endurance athletes doing 20 reps, doing 30 reps of everything. They're seeing the big bulky power lifters
Yes.
doing 1 to 5 reps. They're seeing the muscular guys doing 8 to 12, right? So it just kind of reinforce this whole thinking.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
With that said, I do think that there's value to going heavier. And heavier, I wouldn't just limit it to the 1 to 5 rep range, but there's 2 benefits when you look at the research that requires heavier weights. When I say heavier, I'm more so saying a weight that you cannot lift for roughly 12 reps. And this would be, one is strength. If you want to maximize your strength, you do need at least a somewhat heavier load. No amount of lightweight lifting will lead to the same amount of strength as lifting challenging to moderately challenging weights. So really, if you're trying to maximize your strength for whatever the reason is that you're trying to gain strength for, you want to train with a weight that leads you somewhere in the range of that you're able to do for somewhere around 1 to 12 reps. Also, bone density. So this is especially important as we're gaining, right? We're getting older. We start losing bone density, assuming we're not strength training, by about 35 years old is when we start losing bone density. That pace picks up as we get older. If we don't lift challenging weights, again, roughly, a weight that we can only lift for 12 reps or even less than 12 reps, we're likely not going to gain bone density. And this has been shown in a couple different studies. There was a study with 56 postmenopausal women. This is out of Western Australia. They chose weights where they could do only 8 reps or only 12 reps with. And they did 3 sets of each exercise. And they found that the women who trained with 8 rep loads, or what I would call moderately heavy weight, they gained bone density in their hips and their thighs. The women who trained with the lighter reps or lighter weights, they gain no bone density. So it's not just the act of strength training that leads to bone density. It's strength training with moderately heavy or heavy weights. So those are 2 instances where heavy matters. But for a lot of the other goals, you could use light, you could use moderate weights, you could use heavy weights and get similar benefits.
Yeah, and I think this is so important for any of our listeners that may be trainers too, right? Because a lot of times what we see is people who may be struggling with bone mineral density issues that have osteopenia or osteoarthritis or osteoporosis are very hesitant to lift anything heavy. And their doctors don't want them to lift anything heavy because they're worried that they're brittle and frail. And so we end up just doing them a disservice by putting them with those really, really light loads, which you just showed us there, are not going to do anything for building bone density. So it's almost like they're getting the right recommendation, like you need to strength train because we associate strength training and resistance training with bone health, but they're not actually hitting the target, which is, no, you have to strength train with a challenging load if you want to see those increases, which is why I think this is a place where, a technology like ARX is very valuable, right? Because you're not actually seeing weights moving, right? And you can consistently push yourself and really challenge yourself with challenging loads that aren't even actually loads, right? It's machine driven. So you're just sort of seeing the improvements there. So super interesting stuff. A couple of other things I had just as far as lifting heavy versus lifting light, and you hit the 2 main ones, is just fatigue, right? I think that's one that's not to be overestimated, is if you're doing 30 reps on every single exercise you're doing, you're just going to be gassed, right? And the systemic fatigue that comes from that, it's potentially going to make it harder for you to train effectively the next training session that comes around. Also, there's not a direct correlation with this, but certainly I've seen it anecdotally, and I think there's some evidence to support it, soreness, right? Again, if you're doing less reps, less muscular contractions, heavier weights, you're probably assuming that you're somewhat experienced as a trainee, right? It's not your first workout ever, going to be less sore than, again, somebody who's doing 20, 30, 40 reps of every single exercise that they're doing. And
Yes.
I think this might be the bigger one as you become more of an advanced trainee, is the ability to consistently track RAR. So your reps in reserve, right? We've seen studies, I think there was one out of the Solent lab that looked at even trained people are not very good at predicting how close they are to failure, right? So if training to failure is your goal, I think it was the advanced trainees were still off by a rep or two in general. The discomfort that comes with training with lower weights is so much higher after a certain point, right? That it becomes harder and harder and harder to actually predict where you are in the set relative to failure, right? So the heavier weight you use, if you can only do 3, it's pretty easy to figure out that at 2, right, you're close to the end, right? So the heavier the weight is, the closer you can generally predict. Did I miss anything else there? Is there any other points that you'd like to make on that?
I love the point you made. I think the fatigue is a big thing. And think about this. One of the studies, by the way, I looked at on the heavy versus light loads, at the end of 6 weeks with the light load, people ended up doing about 3 times the amount of total reps versus the heavy load. So just think about that. One group did, I think it was about 600 total reps in the study, and the other group did about 1,700 reps. So that fatigue is a huge factor. And then the third thing you talked about is the experience itself. There were 2 studies where they had people train with moderately heavy weights and light weights. And in both studies, they asked people to train the failure. One of these studies, immediately after the set, they said, did you enjoy that? Rated on a scale. And then the other study did it after the workout. So basically they were just trying to see moderate versus light weights. If you're going all the way through the failure, what is the experience like for the trainee? And in both studies, people said that the light weight taking the failure was a worse experience. In fact, one of the studies said that the whole workout experience was, what was the word they said? They described it as displeasing and as a negative. So they did not like training because every set was going on for so long. And when you're training with light weights, if you hit failure on your 25th rep or 20th rep, that means you're probably going through 5 or 10 or 12 reps where your muscles are burning. And every rep, you're probably thinking to yourself, when is this freaking thing going to stop? Am I done yet? No, I still got another rep. No, I still got another rep. I want to get this over with. It's a crappy experience on the trainee to use light weights and push to failure. It's like you're basically choosing with your weights. Do you want to have an unpleasant experience at the start when you lift it and you're like, oh, this is kind of heavy? Or do you want to have an unpleasant experience at the end when you choose a light weight and you're just like, oh, now this is burning and it keeps going and going? I'd rather just get the unpleasantness out of the way at the start, choose the heavier weight, have the set end earlier in terms of the experience itself. But that's me. And apparently that's some people into these studies.
Yeah, no, I think that's so many good points there. And I think that's probably the average trainee's experience as well. Especially, it seems like men in general tend to be a little softer, not a little bit, generally softer across the board than women too. So I would say most men I know would rather get the discomfort over with earlier and just kind of get that out of the way. So I think the big takeaway there is, when it comes to training, when it comes to using heavy weights or light weights, it's really probably use a combination of both, right? Keep your training interesting. But think about what your goals are when you're programming, or if you're a trainer, how you're programming for your clients. If bone density is their goal, you probably shouldn't be doing, 30 reps on every single exercise with them. We should probably be increasing the weight, trying to use something challenging. And then don't be afraid to lift heavy weights, like especially if you're moving slow, under control, you've got supervision, you're using machines, right? You're going to be safe. And maybe that's a good segue. I did want to get into the stretching, but I think this might be a good segue into the idea of free weights versus machines, right? Because I think with heavy weights, especially, people get hesitant. They don't want to get hurt, especially if they're not acclimated to training. They're not advanced trainees. They worry that if they lift too heavy, they're going to hurt themselves. And there is a real risk of that, especially depending on what you're doing, right? If you've never deadlifted before and you load 4 plates on each side and you just try to yank it up, and YOLO lift it, you're probably going to end up in the ER, right?
Yes.
But if you know what you're doing and you know how to use the tool appropriately, it really shouldn't matter too much whether you're using free weights or machines. But why don't you talk to us a little bit about your experience with this debate, because it's still raging in our industry, and some of the takeaways that you have from your time as a personal trainer.
Both have advantages. I don't think that one is way superior to the other. I looked at a bunch of studies comparing free weights versus machines for strength and hypertrophy, and there are some that favor free weights, but there was a meta-analysis that was published last year in 2020 that found that the strength gains are similar and muscle growth is also about the same if you're choosing equal amounts of challenging weights or the same relative difficulty and you're doing the same amount of work. The difference with the strength comes in where it's, if you're looking to get stronger in the squat, you're going to lift more weight ultimately in a back squat by training the back squat versus doing a machine like a leg press. So it's specific to the tool that you're using where you're going to maximize your benefit. So it is important to you, if it is important to you to up your deadlift and your squat weights, you should train those exercises. But I think a lot of this has to do with user preference. Some people really love the traditional powerlifting exercises, bench press, squat, deadlift. So if they're happy training those, then they continue. But a lot of people like machines as well. And I think that it's what's available to you, what you prefer, because ultimately you need to make your workouts. And if you're dreading a workout because you don't like what you're doing, it's not going to help you. But in terms of results, in general, both of these work, contrary to the long-held belief that machines are inferior to free weights.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with everything you said there. I am going to step up on my soapbox here for a minute, though, because there's nothing that infuriates me more as I got my master's in strength and conditioning, is seeing, and I think it's Sorinex, which makes really high-end strength training equipment as well as squat racks and things like that. And every time they pop up on my Instagram, all I see is these beautiful D1 football programs with just power racks everywhere. And it drives me fucking insane because it's such a waste of athletic potential. And what I mean by that is, we always think of and generalize that machines are for old people. They're for people that don't know what they're doing. They're for people that are inexperienced and don't have the body control to do advanced, powerlifting things with barbells. And all of that could arguably be true. But I think there's so much utility in properly designed functional machines that athletes can benefit from that you just don't see anymore in programs, right? There's only a few college programs in the country that are still utilizing tools like MedX and hammer strength machines. And, Florida State comes to mind. Mike Bradley's basketball program down there has an amazing weight room. But, some of the things I highlighted here for this conversation is safety, right? Just in general, you can't drop a machine on your head, right? If it's properly built. And I'm sure all of our listeners have seen some kind of horrible Instagram or YouTube incident of somebody, crushing their windpipe with a chest press that they should have never been attempting, right? It's the ability to push yourself. If you know you're not going to drop something or you can't hurt yourself with it, I've found that you can push yourself a little bit harder than you might otherwise if you're worried about, I'm going to drop this on my freaking neck. I love the progressions of properly designed machines, right? MedX in particular, 2-pound increments. So you can really see those small improvements, which again, you can do with micro weights. And I want to hear your thoughts. I'm ranting right now.
Go for it.
That you can do with the barbells, right? Like you've got those micro loads that you can do. I think it's just less worry about form, right? You don't have to harp so much on form because you're typically in a controlled movement pattern. It makes AOTs, it makes finishers significantly easier to implement when you just can drop a pin instead of taking weights off, doing all those other things. And then the biggest thing to me that I just don't understand with schools with high level weight programs is the ability to work around injuries. Like that just baffles my mind, because what are these kids doing in football programs when they blow out their freaking knee? Like you're just going to be working upper body. You've got no leg curls. You've got no leg extensions. And a lot of these high level programs, like there's nothing. There's no isolated movements. And how are you going to continue to train those people? So, and obviously if you've got those injuries, machines that allow isolateral work, I think is great, because we know the cross training effect is super important. And then the last one, and then I want to hear your thoughts on all of this, is just the ubiquity of machines, right? You can go anywhere in the world, and if you don't know how to use dumbbells, which a lot of people don't, and I'm never surprised at how bad people are at using weights, and realizing like, oh, most people shouldn't use free weights that come to a personal trainer, right? Some of the things I see people do is like, how do you not have the body control to do that? But people don't, right?
Mhm.
So to just be able to sit down and say, hey, just push this out a few times, right, and get the benefits, or pull this down a few times and get the benefits, I think is so powerful. I'm done. I'm stepping off my soapbox.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I want to throw it back to you though, Logan. So to complement your last point, when I've talked to people who train with dumbbells, I can say this is I talked to some of my family recently, and then some of my friends' family, and these are people in their 60s and 70s that train with dumbbells. Typically, they're doing curls and shoulder press. They might do a dumbbell chest press. They might do a row. When you think about what I just mentioned, yeah, that's most of the upper body muscles, but it's not a lot of the whole body, and there's many other things you can do. And I find that typically people, if they're not very knowledgeable about dumbbells, they're not really training their full body. And if you go through a line of equipment, of machines, you're training your full body. The question I want to ask you is, why do you think what you described before is the case, where college programs or athletic programs are focused on squat racks and free weights, and then if you go into why do you think that is the culture for powerlifting, but also people who are playing sports? Why are they mostly barbell and dumbbell focused?
So I think it's multifaceted. I think Mark Asanovich, who's the legendary strength coach of multiple NFL teams and a good friend, lives in Wayzata, has a gym out of his garage. He was a machine-based high intensity practitioner at the highest level. And he talks a lot about the history of how it sort of became a powerlifting and Olympic lifting community. And quite honestly, it was strength training programs popped up at these schools in the late 70s, early 80s, because they saw the other high level programs had incorporated it. And he does a fantastic job of talking about how at the University of Nebraska, they got kind of conned into having to have a weight training program because nobody wanted to come to Lincoln anymore. So they used it as sort of an offering. And maybe you were there when he was talking about this at our resistance exercise. Yep. So I think that's part of it, right? And it's sort of trickled down into the community where programs saw that they needed strength training. They went to the power lifters and the Olympic lifters because those were the biggest guys. And they said, oh, okay, we'll just make our athletes do that. And so they taught them strength training and powerlifting and Olympic lifting. Now, the thing you have to understand with high level athletes is that they are not normal human beings, right? So they can get results with anything. So it could be bands and, Tae Bo and whatever else they're doing at D1 programs. It doesn't matter. They're going to get results. The reason I think they use these tools is because they see other high-level programs having success, again, because they recruit better, because they do all these other things better, and they associate the strength and conditioning program. So they go, throw out all of these crappy MedX machines. We got to do what Ohio State is doing. We got to get squat racks and stuff in here. And it's happened over the course of decades. But it really doesn't matter what the tool is. It's, in my mind, the reason that machines are a better tool for high level athletes is because of the injury prevention side. Because I don't want Patrick Mahomes, who's making $500 million to put 500 pounds on his cervical vertebrae and do jump squats with it. Like, I just
saw
don't
that.
think,
Yes.
yeah, I know it's ridiculous.
The
So
quarterback, yeah.
yeah, it was great. And he didn't have that much on there, but the stuff that they do with athletes, because they can get away with it, it doesn't apply to the general population. So again, stepping back off soapbox.
I want to hear your thoughts on this, because I don't have a ton of I don't really have a theory about why that's the case, even though my perspective is similar to yours. When you look at the injury risk, it is less with machines. And there was a study out of Australia where they looked at injuries over 14 years in one county. And sure enough, almost all the injuries, most of the injuries are from free weights. And if not, then they're from like aerobics classes and dance classes and jumping drills. So if you look at those things, and I think of boxing classes, and all of those encompass, I think it was about 95% of the injuries that took place in this near 15-year period. Machines are way less responsible, especially if you don't use machines when they're broken. You're avoiding most of the injury risk between not using broken machines, avoiding broken machines, and using proper form. Machines are extremely safe. I do think that with trainers in general, and maybe this extends to the athletic arena, it's not very sexy to have workouts that have consistently the same exercises or similar exercises. With free weights, you can do a million different things. If you saw that show Quarterback with Patrick Mahomes, his trainer was doing what I would say is there were a lot of sexy exercises, really unique choices, some things I've never seen before. And if you want to stand out, it's easier to do it that way than to be like, well, we're going to do the leg press again and the leg curl again. I've shifted the order a little bit, but we're basically doing, 7 out of the same 8 exercises we did last time with one different. It's just not as visually appealing and mentally stimulating. But if you're like, hey, last time we did jump squats, now we're doing lunge jumps, and we're doing clean and jerk, that's different than if you're whatever. There's more variety there, which can make you look better or more skilled or more advanced. That's my belief on one aspect of it, of what I think you said is a very multifaceted approach for why they're generally going barbell and dumbbell training.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a huge factor in it, though, right? Is the sex appeal of these different exercises and these crazy movements. And, what I always think of and tell clients or just people that I'm talking to about exercise in general, when they go like, why shouldn't I do things like Patrick Mahomes? It's like the order of operations actually works backwards from what most people think, right? You shouldn't look at Patrick Mahomes and LeBron James and think, I should do that. Like, it trickles down. It's the exact opposite. It's, what does Patrick Mahomes' grandmother do that works for her? And then that works up. But it's so true. Like, you can add the extra stuff with the high level athletes, because, and this, and other trainers know this, trying to teach somebody to squat that's never exercised before, that's 45 years old and out of shape and 50 pounds overweight is, and threw out their back last year, is almost fucking impossible, right? To do it correctly. And I wouldn't feel confident doing that with most people. Now, I know people who are movement specialists that specialize in that kind of stuff that I would feel confident sending somebody to. It's not me, right? But what I can do with that person is throw them on a Med-X leg press and feel extremely safe that all they have to do is push this weight away from them, and they can't really screw it up, right? So that works up the chain. It doesn't work down the chain. You can't do one-legged Bosu ball squats with a 95-year-old woman, but you can do a Med-X leg press with a 95-year-old woman and with Patrick Mahomes, right? So I think keeping that in mind, but you hit the nail on the head, man. It's all, people want the secret sauce. And we were talking about it too. We just are more evidence-based in what the secret sauce might be.
Yes.
Where other people are looking for, the magic one exercise, we're looking for the magic frequency or the magic intensity or the magic whatever that is. So, we all fall victim to that stuff. But I don't think we have time for stretching and flexibility today. That's okay.
I've got a few more minutes if you're good for
We
it.
can. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm totally fine. I just wanted to be sensitive to your time. So
I do want to just add one more note in the free weights versus weight training thing. By the way, for all we know, Patrick Mahomes' grandmother is jacked, and
yeah,
she's like an incredible.
And I'm not saying she can't be.
But the whole free weight versus machine thing, half my workout is using free weights. I would say roughly half my workout program, half my exercises are free weights. And none of this is to say that you shouldn't use free weights. They both have their benefits. Free weights are way more versatile. You can do way more with them. I personally love dumbbells. I do use barbells a little bit. But in my past, I was a power lifter with a powerlifting coach for a while. I've done CrossFit at one point. I've done bodybuilding in a more traditional sense. I think that free weights and machines should all exist in the world of training, and that we shouldn't just look at, well, if you're an athlete, use free weights. If you're an older adult, use machines. I think we should look at it as like, this is a buffet with all these different options, and we should take the ones that work best for us, whether machines or free weights. I just think people should not look at free weights as, oh, that's why you should use to be more athletic, to be more jacked, to be stronger. And then machines, I should only use those if I have an injury or if I am worried about injury risk. So just let's eliminate that dichotomy and just look at it as what works best for you or your client, and then choose those exercises and those equipment based on that.
Yeah, and no, that's a great point. And obviously it's easy to get, or at least for me to get worked up on this stuff. But the majority of people that I've been training for the last few months have free weights, right? I love free weights. I love dumbbells and barbells. It just frustrates me, like you said, that dichotomy that people think that the more advanced you are, the less you need to use machines. And to me, it's the exact opposite, right? It's like you said, it's a buffet. We should be able to use everything available to us. But if the tool you have is the tool you have, how can we use that as smart and effectively as possible? So knowing how to use different tools effectively, I think is super important. Well, let's touch on this quick, because this is a great one that I think people will be interested in. It's this idea of stretching, static stretching versus resistance training for flexibility benefits. And there's been a lot of papers on this over the last few years. Talk to us briefly about what the old thinking was, how people thought about stretching and resistance training, and then what kind of the newest research is starting to point to as far as flexibility benefits.
With flexibility benefits, we looked at stretching as a way to become more flexible. So if you stretch, you lengthen your muscles, you become more flexible, your joints have a greater range of motion. Strength training, in the traditional perspective, did the opposite. It made your muscles tighter. It made you more restricted in your movement. So you would, if you're a bodybuilder who's strength training often, you don't really have a lot of mobility. But if you're someone who stretches a lot, you have an excess, you have a ton of mobility. And what we've seen is that's not really the case, is it, Logan? Is strength training can make people more flexible.
Yeah, and I think this will be an interesting thing to see down the road as we start to look at, more and more research piling up, which I know it is at the moment, on these partial range of motion repetitions, long range of motion partials. What is the comparison going to be like there with flexibility benefits, maybe 5 years, 10 years down the road, once they finally get to actually doing those studies? Because we've seen this comparison of static stretching versus full range, which for the longest time we thought was the holy grail, what you had to do to elucidate the most benefits. Now that we're seeing, maybe you don't need to do a full range, well, is there going to be any detriment there from a flexibility perspective? It's yet to be determined.
It's a good point. And just a detail on that, the strength training, there's a number of strength training studies that show people gain range of motion from lifting. But the detail on that is that it's through full range of motion training. So if you're doing a half a rep, it's not improving joint range of motion. So if you're doing the full bicep curl from a straight elbow all the way up until your wrist is near your shoulder, that's full range of motion, and that's what leads to better range of motion. So yeah, as we talked about before, and you've been talking about, is short range of motion on the stretched end leads to more muscle and strength, but maybe it reduces range of motion for the joints, or maybe it limits mobility in the joints, or maybe it just has no impact in improving joint mobility, which I'll be curious to see as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
I do want to say.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
One thing I have talked a lot about, and this came up in one of the courses I was teaching yesterday, and ultimately, this is leading to a question I'm going to pitch you, Logan. There are a number of studies over a long period of time about stretching before activity, and we've seen that there's two main outcomes from this about, like, if you're stretching for going to play a sport, if you're stretching before going to run, or if you're stretching before lifting. And so there have been all these studies, and basically the studies are showing that, one, stretching does not reduce the risk of injury. And then if specifically you're stretching before lifting, it actually makes you weaker. And so it can reduce the amount of reps you can perform in an exercise, and according to one review of research, anywhere from 9 to 28%. Meaning that if you're doing about 15 reps in a set, if you stretch, you only will be able to do about 11 reps because your muscles are weaker. So it seems like the whole belief of static stretching before an activity is either ineffective if you're going to play a sport or run, or it's actually detrimental if you're going to weightlift. And I say all this because yesterday I was in class, and a number of my students play collegiate sports. And there's a few that are on the soccer team, the men's soccer team, a few that are on the women's volleyball team, and a few that are on the men's basketball team. And I asked them in class, do you stretch before practice? Every single one raised their hand to say yes. This research has been out for a while. And one of the articles I wrote cited research that goes back to 2005, 18 years ago. Yet sports teams are still stretching before workouts and before practice. Logan, why is this the case? I don't get it. This research has been out. This is not controversial. I mean, maybe it's surprising, but it's not like there's some research supporting one belief and one supporting a different belief. It's pretty clear this is not a good idea to stretch before activity, or at least it's not going to benefit you. Why are people still stretching before their practices and their games and their workouts?
Yeah, I think it's just what we've always done, right? So it's the coaching lore that sort of gets passed down from one generation to the next. And you kind of see the same thing with the conversation we were having before about powerlifting and Olympic lifting. Like, it takes a long time for the research to actually catch up with these programs, right? And it's probably at least an 18-year gap, it seems like, if that's been out since 2005. But again, what I've seen, I was fortunate enough in my master's program to have a bunch of strength and conditioning coaches come in and chat with us about theirs. So we had a guy from the Minnesota Wild, I think the Chicago Blackhawks. There was a guy that was a assistant strength and conditioning coach for the Kansas City Chiefs, and then all different levels of sports. So it was pretty cool to hear those people chatting, and almost unanimously, none of those programs are doing static stretching anymore. Like the idea of like bend and, like we used to do when we were little kids playing soccer, that's not happening there. So the research is reaching those people, and then it takes time, I think, to trickle down to the lower programs. So college sports is probably going to be next. And I know for a fact some high level D1 programs don't static stretch anymore, right? It's all about dynamic warm-ups now, which the research seems to point to is beneficial, right? So doing actual dynamic movement for your warm-up as opposed to static stretching does have benefits, and is a safety mechanism as well. So it just takes time, man, which is unfortunate. Yes. But your average, what school is this at?
This is at it's a smaller school. It's an independent.
Like UCO or something.
It's they're an independent school, so they are not in the NCAA system. They're in a separate system. So it's a smaller school. They have 6 athletic programs. 6 sports.
So imagine it's starting in let's just use football as an example, right? But let's say it's starting in the NFL because they're getting the highest paid, most educated, most up on the recent research people. Then it's fizzling down to D1, then it's going to D2, then it's going to D3, and then maybe it's going to the unaffiliated programs in colleges, right? Because and then it's going to high school. So it just takes time, which again is unfortunate because you hate to see people getting injured, but you're in a cool position where maybe you talk to those coaches and you share some of that research with them and you try to keep those players safe. So
trying to expedite that process.
Yeah, 100% doing the Lord's work. So I'd love to just spend a little bit of time and then we can sort of wrap this whole thing up, just talking about these stretching places, right? Because there's a lot of them have sprung up, these boutique stretching studios. And I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with going and getting stretched. We talked about some of the detriments of stretching maybe right before strength training and how that can negatively impact your workouts. I haven't seen any research really that shows like stretching is bad long-term. If you enjoy stretching or doing yoga or any of those things, I think this goes into that old thinking, right? Those same, high school strength coaches that are still having people stretch for forever. It just takes a while for research to catch up, and people have just decided we're going to make money off of this old way of thinking, right? This old static stretching. And I just see promises from that stuff on those websites that seems predatory to me in a lot of ways. So I just want people to be aware of, looking out for themselves when it comes to what are you actually trying to get out of this program, right? So we don't have to name any names of any of these places, but if you go to one of these places and they're telling you, I've seen it's promoting vitality and recovery and all of these things, there's no evidence that shows stretching is associated with recovery or lack of soreness post-exercise. So again, if it feels good, do it, but just being conscious of this snake oil that people may or may not be trying to sell you.
Yes. And I want to highlight that one of the things you just said is stretching does not reduce soreness. So this is another counterpoint for why people stretch before an activity. But there's research showing this when people stretch before a workout or before a sport, their self-rated levels of soreness in the following days does not differ from the people who do the same things but do not stretch. So it has no soreness protection that it offers. Now, there is some research coming out, and I think you and I have spoken about this off the podcast previously, is that there is some research showing that you might be able to gain muscle from stretching. What it shows so far, at least, and this is still an emerging area of research that's not conclusive, what it seems like so far is that when people get this benefit, that they're spending hours a week stretching. I'm not saying 2 hours. I'm not saying 3 hours. The last number I saw is at least 7 hours a week stretching. So we're talking about you're spending an hour a night stretching at home every night while you're watching like your hour-long TV show. So, and that is for a small amount of muscle hypertrophy, muscle growth. If you're not willing, if you're looking to do everything possible to gain more muscle, it might be worth it. I personally don't see it as worth that large time investment. But yes, it's not known to reduce blood pressure or increase muscle strength or increase energy levels. I do think there are benefits to sitting quietly and stretching, some internal reducing anxiety, getting the same benefits as like a yoga or meditation if you're breathing deeply, but it's not necessarily going to cause a lot of the same benefits that you'd be getting from doing other activities, especially strength training.
Yeah, and one of those studies I think you're talking about, they had them in a boot doing basically like I think it was a dorsiflexion, or maybe it was a plantar flexion. I can't remember which way. Yeah. So they were doing plantar flexion, so pointing your toes away for like hours. I mean, 20 something hours and just like painfully stretched too. So to me,
I think it was an 8 out of 10 on the pain level.
Yeah, so it's interesting though, because I think a lot of these mechanisms are actually probably tied together. And what I mean about that is this stretch induced hypertrophy mechanism and this long length partial mechanism might have similar mechanistic drivers, right? Because we're talking about the stretch position, right? So there's something to that piece of it. I don't know if we'll ever elucidate actually the underlying reasons why that is, but in the meantime, right, if you want to use that stretch position, awesome, more power to you. I think, I would personally rather get all of the benefits of flexibility in a fraction of the time, which you can do by strength training twice per week through a full range of motion. So if you're worried about flexibility, especially as you get older, improving joint range of motion, all those things, it's pretty conclusive at this point that if you work through that full range of motion, you do a full body resistance training routine, you're going to get all the same benefits you would of just doing a normal traditional static stretching routine. Anything else to add there before we kind of wrap this whole thing up, Sean?
No, you summarized that beautifully. I would just say on a separate note, relating back to, we talked about weights before, and we talked about weights as far as training with light weights versus heavy weights, and we talked about machines versus free weights. Regardless of the amount of weights you choose or whether you use free weights or machines, I would just say as an overarching piece of advice, push yourself. When you finish your set, you should have 0 or 1, at most 2 reps left in the tank, but I would say ideally 0 to 1. So you want to push yourself. And I make this recommendation keeping in mind that most people don't even come close to training the muscle failure. And most people aren't choosing heavy enough weights if they're trying to gain strength or bone density, or that they're just not pushing themselves far enough. So if you're listening to this and you are not getting a coach of some kind that's working with you, I recommend that you push yourself as hard as you can, basically as hard as you can when you're going to the gym every time. And if you do that, regardless of the amount of weight load or the weight load or the type of equipment, you're going to get all these different benefits that your training can offer.
Yeah, I think that point can't be overstated enough. And honestly, I think that's a perfect recap of everything when it comes to lifting heavy versus light, free weights versus machines. The only last thing there that we obviously just touched on was you don't need to stretch for improvements in range of motion. So I'd love to learn where our listeners can find out a little bit more about you, if you want to share some social, and then anything that's maybe coming in the next couple months. I know you've got some stuff you're working on that's more private, but is there anything you can share with our listeners as far as things you've got going, books, articles, where they can find out more about you once you share some of that stuff?
Absolutely. 2 recommendations. One, you can find out more about me as well as read over 200 articles I've written if you go to SeanPreuss.com, and that's Sean, Sean. Last name is Preuss. The E is before the U. SeanPreuss.com. And also, I am putting education onto Instagram, different research findings. You can find me on Instagram as Dr. Sean Preuss. And that's it. Logan, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed the conversations.
Sean, it's been so good to see you. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Please like and subscribe if you don't already. And we'll be back next week for more Exercise is Bullshit. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.